Hello, everyone. I'm going to try to be brief talking about William Neill. I have some audio-visual aids. I can't see myself on the screen and only the little thing on the top, but have some audio-visual aids that I'm going to use in the old-fashioned way. William Neill. Here we are. Can you see that okay? This is a drawing of Neill by Jerry Mangan. We've already mentioned him. We mentioned his interesting essay on getting drunk with George Campbell Hay. And this is his drawing of William Neill that he did for me. And he's standing on the two dictionaries, Dwelly and Jameson, the Gaelic and Scots dictionaries. That's obviously a reference to his use of both those languages. Jerry Cambridge wrote an article about William Neill calling him the best Scottish poet you've never heard of. And that, until recently, was fair enough, I guess. Hugh Macmillan wrote a little article about him, and he pointed out that he was largely ignored amongst other Scottish literary figures. He said, Willie worked for a living, lived in the southwest, and didn't travel regularly to the capital or the centre of caprice and arrogance, as he called it. And because of his geographic isolation and the cosy cliquery, maybe, of the Scottish poetry scene in Edinburgh, he largely seemed to be an outsider, not particularly part of it for a long time. Willie was born in 1922 and died in 2010. A vast part of his career was in the Air Force. He joined the Air Force just before the war and served in it for 30-odd years. And he didn't actually start writing poetry until he was in his 40s. He was born in Ayrshire and he finished his career in Galloway as a school teacher there. And he is becoming more prominent now, not least because of the book edited by Hugh Macmillan and published by the Drunk News Press, Leaves of the Years, to celebrate his 100th anniversary of his birth, which had several essays about him in it. I'll come on to where we go from there in a minute, but just to say, before I got involved with William Neill, I had edited the collected poems of Mary Simon, which I did along with Fred Freeman, and the collected poems of Crombie Saunders, which I did along with Donald Saunders. There we are. There's a point, by the way, about this display. There we are. And when I was asked to do the collected poems of William Neill, I thought it would go nicely with those and make a nice trilogy. It turned out to be somewhat different, as you'll see. Can you see that okay? And of course, there was also volume 2. 750 pages, 930 odd poems. And the poems are not placed nicely on the pages, they're crammed in as they can be, as they could be, had to be rather. If they had been spaced out and put nicely on the pages, it would be 8 volumes. So it was an enormous task that I took on along with Tom Hubbard. And I should say at this point, if it hadn't been for Tom, we wouldn't have got anywhere. Tom was a major research source, never mind the National Library of Scotland. Tom could delve into his library or his study and bring out letters with unpublished poems from William Neill, magazines, journals, and all sorts of things, as he knew him well. Of those 930 poems, by the way, some of them are exceptionally long. You know, the translation of Homer's Odyssey into Scots, and Merriman's The Midnight Court from Irish to Gaelic. Neill was quite clear about how he saw himself. Macher, bard, and poet, it says in the front of the book. So that reflects on the 3 languages he wrote in. There's also an important point of how he saw his role as poet. He saw himself as a people's poet, and he saw himself as a craftsman. He talked about carpenters of verse, and he said, constructing a poem is like constructing a table. If the leg doesn't work, the table's no good. And Tom Scott, when he wrote about it, he said in his first book, 4 Points of the Saltire, he said that he's very much a public poet, a bard, rather than an introspective poeticule. I don't really know what poeticule means, but it sounds impressive anyway. As you know, he wrote in 3 languages, and the balance is just about equal. I think, if you go through all the poems in the books in English, Scots, and Gaelic. He was what you might call a non-native Gaelic speaker, although he wouldn't have liked that term at all. But he didn't have the language in his youth. He learned it at a later age. And he graduated, after he left the Air Force, he went to do Celtic Studies at the University of Edinburgh, graduated in 1971. There is an interesting, as we edited the book, which there were many problems in editing it, apart from the sheer size. For example, the orthography of the Gaelic poems, which changed over time. The fact that he wrote under several pseudonyms, and just finding the material was very hard in itself. But we discovered a couple of interesting things. For example, the order of writing. We were told that he started writing in 1969 after he left the Air Force. But some of the Gaelic poems are actually dated 1963 and in the 60s. When apparently that's before he went to do Celtic Studies at the University of Edinburgh. So did he have some Gaelic before that? We just don't know. There's not enough information about his life to really get to the heart of that. And that's an interesting point, because there's not a lot of manuscript material in the National Library or elsewhere that tells us a great deal about the writing process. A lot of the manuscripts that he sold to the National Library of Scotland for £7,000 in 2008, I think, isn't very useful. It has some letters to sources in Italy, Denmark, and so on, but it also has a lot of invoices for appearances in the BBC and things like that, which are not particularly helpful in our research. So there is a problem there researching aspects of his life, despite the vast volume of poems that are in the collection. He was a very talented linguist, as we've already heard about some of the other poets we've mentioned, which there's a lot to be shared there. He translated from German, Goethe, Heine, Meyer. So he translated John Henry Mackay, who, strangely enough, was a Scot who wrote it only solely in German. But he was discovered and translated back into Scots for his sins. And from French, he translated Rimbaud, de Bellay. Giuseppe Belli sonnets in Italian as well, which Robert Garrioch, as you may know, also translated quite a lot of Belli. And he liked the fact that Belli's language was sort of Romanesque, or Romanesco, rather than standard Italian, because he saw it as being a comparison with Scots and Scots English, if you like. And Carlo Porta was a Milanese poet, and again had a particular dialect of Italian. So he did immense work in translation. He also translated from and into Irish, Welsh, and several other languages. Partly because of this, he was well regarded on the continent. And probably, and he would argue, most people would argue, that he was better regarded on the continent as he ever was in his own country, Scotland. His work was translated into Danish and Italian. It was going to be translated into Kurdish at one time, but that didn't come off. And it was published in journals and a couple of books on the continent in translated form. He noted in an interview with Jerry Cambridge at the age of 77, "I can't understand why it's been so difficult to be recognised in Scotland when I've been accepted on the continent." And this was true. He was delighted when an Italian PhD student wrote a thesis about him, towards the end of his life, and he was really pleased about that. But he still felt, and there's no doubt about this, he felt somewhat bitter about his lack of recognition of Scotland right up until the end. There is, as I say, difficult to get much more research in terms of his life and the process of writing, but there's a massive amount of research, obviously, to be done in the way of textual analysis of the vast book, the vast 2 volumes of his poems in 3 languages. Just to finish off with a couple of quotations. Raymond Vates on William Neill. "He writes brilliantly in all 3 languages of Scotland, and this distinction allows him to plunge deeply into the complexity of the Scottish psyche." And this is a creation from, who's it from? Sorry, from someone famous. I think it's Tom Scott. Neill is a man of wide and deep mind, and there are no problems affecting Scotland today that don't surface somewhere in his work. So I hope people will read and comment on the massive 2 volumes that we've completed now. It's still available for sale, and it will be on Google Play Books by the end of this month. So it'll be available in ebook form too. That's it, I think. Thank you, everybody.